the sun crested Ironwood in a haze of red dust, a beautiful, ominous morning that promised a scorching day to follow. The air, usually crisp with the scent of sage, was thick, heavy, and already tasted of fine, pulverized iron ore. For Caleb Shaw, leading the convoy, it felt less like a logistics run and more like a march toward certain doom, a funeral procession for the legacy he was trying to save. His heavy, dusty pickup shuddered over the uneven track. Caleb's stomach was a tight knot of cold, familiar dread that had settled in the moment his father, Victor Shaw, had outlined the route. This dread had nothing to do with the valuable, illicit contraband bouncing under canvas in the truck beds behind him, goods worth a fortune, and everything to do with the calculated, careless words of his father. Lila, she uses that path for her daily ride. Victor Shaw, in his blind ancestral rage, had used his own daughter as bait. He was betting that Elias Thorne would never cross the line of murder. Victor was wrong. In Ironwood, every moral constraint was shed for the sake of the claim, and the consequence was always paid in the currency of the young. Caleb's sister, Lila Shaw, was barely 22, but she possessed the only true, untainted innocence left in the territory. She was the family's gentle heart, a counterpoint to the brutality that defined the Shaw name. She found comfort not in the ranch's violence, but in the rhythm of the wind and the absolute loyalty of her ghost. She saw the river trail, the very route Caleb was now barreling toward as her sanctuary. She dreamed of art schools, of cities where the sky wasn't choked with dust, of a world that didn't know the difference between a Shaw and a Thorne. Caleb gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He rode point in the heavy, armor-plated pickup. His eyes constantly scanned the tree line, assessing sight lines, potential firing positions, and escape routes. He had only a handful of men, 5 loyal, hardened Shaw veterans, each of them a well-drilled instrument of Victor's will. None were eager to tangle with Thorne's highly organized security, but all were too terrified of Victor's wrath to refuse this suicide run. We are walking into this, Caleb thought, his mind a frantic scramble. And the only thing that matters is that Lila isn't here. Before dawn, Caleb had done the only thing he could. He had sent a runner, a quiet, desperate, anonymous plea to a neutral friend in the nearby town, a friend who knew Lila's habits, asking them to find her and detour her ride with any excuse possible. He had betrayed his father's plan and endangered himself to save his sister. He had done all he could. But fate and Ironwood rarely respected good intentions, and today fate had a cruel irony in store. As they approached the designated path, a narrow, curving stretch where the peaceful river trail met the Thorne Syndicate's legal border, Caleb felt the air change, the ambient silence becoming unnaturally heavy. It was the silence before the storm, a void where the sounds of birds and wind should have been. The shadows under the dense cedars suddenly seemed too deep, too still. Caleb took a deep, ragged breath. He could feel the eyes on him, cold and professional. He checked his side mirror, watching his men behind him in the second truck. Their faces were grim, hardened masks, fingers hovering over triggers. They knew this was a trap. They were waiting for the flash of muzzle fire that would mark the start of the final conflict. Caleb reached down, his own hand brushing the smooth grip of the heavy-caliber pistol resting in his center console. He hated this. He hated the dust, the guns, the endless generational need for blood. Rounding the sharp bend, the convoy slowed to a crawl. A cluster of expensive, black SUVs was parked haphazardly just beyond the border, marker clearly on what the Thornes claimed as their territory, and a dozen men in dark, tactical gear stood casually, effectively blocking the narrow path. They were Thorne security, but their posture was all wrong, too relaxed, too numerous, and too well armed for simple patrolling. Elias Thorne hadn't sent a patrol. He'd sent a welcoming party, a perfectly staged tableau of intimidation. Caleb recognized the man stepping out from the middle vehicle. Jasper Thorne, Elias's nephew. Jasper was entitled and reckless, viewing the feud as a thrilling game. Jasper had a cruel, arrogant smirk fixed on his face. "Morning, Caleb," Jasper called out, his voice smooth and contemptuous. He adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist, a glittering piece of metal that seemed to mock the poverty of the land they were fighting over. "Out for a morning drive? You seem to have wandered off the reservation. This trail is Syndicate property. I suggest you turn those trucks around before someone gets confused about whose land they're standing on." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He used the silence to shift his focus to the trees, calculating the kill zone. He noticed two distinct glints of light on the ridge, the unmistakable scopes of snipers, perfectly positioned to take out both drivers and the gunners in the back. This wasn't a warning. It was a full-scale confrontation designed to showcase Thorne's absolute, lethal authority. The message was clear. "We own this air, this ground, and your lives." "The goods go through, Jasper," Caleb finally responded, keeping his voice level, projecting a confidence that was slowly bleeding out of him. "You can tell your Uncle Victor Shaw made his claim. This trail belongs to Ironwood, not your paper deeds. It's a public passage." Jasper laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor. He took a single, deliberate step closer, resting his hand casually on the pistol tucked into his waistband, a clear, unambiguous threat. "Your father should teach you some history, Caleb. Ironwood belongs to the one who takes it, not the one who files the paperwork, and the Thornes took this trail decades ago. Now, turn around or you lose the trucks, the cargo, and maybe a few fingers. Your choice." It was a stalemate, a tense, breathless moment where generations of hatred were balanced precariously on a razor's edge. Caleb started to formulate his last-ditch plan, ram the SUV, create cover, and retreat when the sound came. And then, from the trail directly behind Jasper, the sound came, the soft, rhythmic thud of a horse galloping too fast. It was an intrusion of life into a scene of impending death, a sudden, sharp betrayal of all of Caleb's desperate planning. Lila Shaw broke into the clearing on Ghost, her beautiful mare riding hard. She was utterly unaware of the frozen tableau of death waiting before her. She was listening to a podcast or music through small white earbuds, her face turned up slightly to the morning sun, oblivious to the fact that her brother, her enemies, and 2 truckloads of contraband were locked in a standoff meant to end in murder. She pulled back sharply on the reins when she saw the convoy, the black SUVs, and the armed men startled by the sudden, violent intrusion on her sanctuary. She instinctively yanked the earbuds out, the small wire snapping against her cheek, the silence rushing in with a roar of gunfire. "Caleb, what's going on?" she called out, her voice a fragile sound in the heavy silence, laced with confusion and fear. Jasper Thorne's cruel smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling realization that hardened into pure shock. Victor Shaw hadn't just trespassed. He had indeed used his own blood, his own daughter, as a shield. It was a monstrous, desperate move that suddenly made the rules of their game obsolete. The Thorne detail leader, a seasoned veteran named Hayes, started to shout, "Stand down. We have civilian presence. Hold your fire." He tried to wave off the snipers he knew were watching, but Jasper was past caution. He saw only the ultimate horrific advantage. If Victor was willing to risk his sister, Jasper would be willing to eliminate the sister. It would be the kind of cruel, unforgettable statement his uncle Elias Thorne needed to cement his absolute victory and break Victor Shaw forever. "She's a distraction. Grab her. Take her out of the way." Jasper screamed, his voice cracking with adrenaline and panic, pulling his sidearm from his waist. Caleb didn't hesitate. He knew the chaos of the immediate moment was the only chance they had for the goods, for his life, but most urgently for Lila. "Go, go. Protect the goods. Drive." He yelled to his men in the rear truck, slamming his foot on the gas pedal and veering his heavy pickup directly toward Jasper's primary black SUV. He aimed to cause a violent, deafening, disorienting crash that would shatter the standoff and confuse the Thorne security team. The moment Caleb's truck collided with the Thorne vehicle, the world shattered. The sound was a metallic, terrible shriek, followed instantly by the eruption of gunfire from both sides, a blinding, deafening symphony of destruction. Caleb's men, trained for a fight, scattered, returning fire in desperate bursts. The Thorne security, caught completely off guard by the speed of the initiation and the unexpected inclusion of Lila, were momentarily disorganized. Lila screamed, pulling Ghost's reins tight, trying to control the terrified mare which bucked and reared at the explosion of noise. Jasper, having been thrown to the ground by the impact, saw his opportunity. His eyes were wide with a murderous focus. He raised his pistol, aiming not at Caleb, but directly at Lila. He wanted to inflict the maximum unforgettable pain on Victor Shaw. Hayes, the seasoned security guard who had seen the whole sequence unfold, Dove sacrificing his own safety in a desperate attempt to tackle Jasper and stop the fatal shot. He was too late. The bullet left Jasper's gun, a loud, definitive crack that echoed over the fighting. But the path of fate is rarely straight. At that exact, horrifying fraction of a second, Caleb's veteran driver, a man named T-Bone, who had been riding in the second truck, saw Jasper raise his gun at Lila. Operating on instinct, he fired a desperate, uncontrolled burst from his sawed-off shotgun through the open window. The spray of buckshot was wild, missing Jasper entirely. Instead, it struck Hayes, the loyal Thorne man who was already mid-dive to save Lila, directly in the chest. Hayes stumbled, falling backward onto the ground, dead before he hit the dirt. Two-Bone, seeing his error, the chaos he had caused, and the escalating violence, fled into the deep cover of the trees, abandoning the fight. Lila, terrified beyond reason, whipped Ghost around, galloping blindly toward the main road, desperate to escape the carnage that had swallowed her sanctuary. Jasper, recovering from the buckshot blast that had only rattled his nerves, was furious that his shot was blocked. He raised his pistol again and fired. This time the bullet struck Lila's mare, Ghost, in the flank. The horse screamed, a sound of agony and terror, collapsing violently in a tangle of limbs and leather, throwing Lila hard onto the unforgiving, rocky ground. The sound of Lila's desperate, guttural cry, a sound of pure, sudden anguish cut through the battle noise, instantly silencing both sides. Caleb burst out of the wreckage of his pickup, his mind fixated on only one thing, screaming his sister's name. Jasper froze, the pistol still warm in his hand, realizing with a sick lurch that he hadn't shot the horse. He had shot at the horse while it was carrying Victor Shaw's daughter. The silence that followed was heavy, an unbearable weight of guilt and consequence, broken only by the whimpering of the dying mare. Caleb rushed to his sister, sliding to his knees beside her still body. She was alive, breathing, but deeply unconscious, her head bleeding severely from the impact with the unforgiving rocks of the river trail. Jasper, scrambling to his feet, saw the damage. His detail was retreating, two of his men nursing wounds, fleeing the uncontrolled violence. Hayes was dead on the ground, a casualty of friendly fire and noble intent. But the real horror, the unquantifiable disaster, was the sight of Victor Shaw's daughter, motionless in the dirt. Jasper Thorne, for the first time in his pampered, entitled life, felt the cold, sick dread of true consequence. He hadn't just won a border skirmish. He had committed an act of war with catastrophic, civilian collateral damage. He turned and ran back toward the surviving Thorne vehicles, climbing into the back seat, shouting frantically at the driver to leave, fleeing the scene as quickly as the now retreating Shaw convoy, abandoning the dying and the dead, leaving the silent, bloody trail to tell its own incriminating truth. By the time the dust settled, the river trail was an open wound on the landscape. 2 Shaw trucks smoldered, 3 men were wounded, and 2 people lay still. The Thornes had taken a loss in Hayes, a veteran who died trying to prevent a crime. The Shaws had suffered the catastrophic injury of Lila, their hope for a different future. Caleb cradled his sister's head, shouting desperately at the retreating dust cloud of the Thorne vehicles. He looked down at the pale, still face of his sister, and felt a cold, crystalline rage, not Victor's hot, ancestral fury, but a focused, terrible sense of responsibility and retribution settle deep into his bones. He knew this wasn't just a fight for land anymore. This was personal, unforgivable. He checked her pulse again. It was faint, weak, but undeniably there. The bleeding was severe. His men, equally devastated by the sight of Lila, secured the least damaged truck, and with agonizing slowness began the frantic, desperate drive back to the Shaw compound's rudimentary clinic. Marshal Jake Riley received the initial report 2 hours later, an intentionally sanitized version delivered by a hysterical local sheriff who tried to frame it as a simple border dispute gone wrong. Riley was seated in the dust-choked sheriff's office in Ironwood Town Square, poring over heavily redacted land deeds that were the root cause of every conflict. He wasn't surprised by the violence Ironwood was designed for it, only by the speed and the shocking savagery of this particular outbreak. When the sheriff nervously stammered out the crucial details, an injured, non-combatant daughter and a dead security guard, Riley closed the file with a decisive, sharp snap that echoed in the empty office. "The gloves are off," he muttered to himself. The death of a civilian and the severe injury to a young woman, regardless of their family name, was a clear federal trigger. It was the justification he had been patiently waiting for, the blood sacrifice needed to grant the federal government access to the feuding territory. At the Shaw compound, the scene was one of panicked, brutal efficiency. Lila was rushed into the small, rudimentary clinic the Shaws maintained, a clean room that suddenly felt hopelessly inadequate for a trauma of this magnitude. Victor Shaw stood over his injured daughter, his massive frame shaking. His face was a shifting mask of disbelief, then denial, and finally terrifying, focused wrath. When the frantic doctor shook his head, delivering the grim news that the damage was severe and the chances of recovery were thin, Victor did not break down. He looked at Caleb, his eyes demanding an answer only fire could provide. "Who fired the shot that put her down?" Victor's voice was low, a dangerous rumble that silenced every man in the room. "Jasper Thorne tried to shoot her, father. The Thorne man, Hayes, took the first bullet. They were running an ambush. Jasper was shooting at her as she fled." Caleb's voice was hollow, choked with guilt. Victor did not hear the guilt. He heard only the name Thorne. His eyes were now pure, unadulterated fire. "Thorne sent his own blood to the field to kill mine. He has no line left. He wants a war. We give him Armageddon. Every contract, every property, every man of his. I want it all." He spun to Silas Knox, his head of security. Find Jasper Thorne. Bring me his head, and the head of his father Elias. We execute the leadership. Tell the men, no prisoners. The blood debt is due. I want the Thorne mansion burning by nightfall. Silas merely nodded. Meanwhile, across the valley at the Thorne mansion, Elias Thorne was receiving the report from a shaken, pale Jasper. Jasper was frantic, desperate to mitigate his role, layering lies over the catastrophic truth. It was self-defense, Uncle Elias. They crashed their truck into the detail. Lila was caught in the crossfire. A complete accident, Jasper stammered, his expensive jacket torn and dusted with river silt. Elias, who had built his empire on precise, controlled cruelty, listened to the chaos and the lies with an unnerving stillness. Hayes is dead, Jasper? My best man dead? Yes, sir. Buckshot, Shaw's men. And Lila Shaw, Victor Shaw's daughter. She is critically injured? Jasper swallowed hard. Yes, sir. It was an accident. The horse. Elias raised a single silencing hand, cutting off the panicked excuses. His initial calculation had exploded into a catastrophe. He looked at his daughter, Audrey Thorne, who stood silently beside the desk. Elias knew that murdering a young woman in the feud was the kind of irreversible act that would bring the entire legal and political hammer down. But the death of Hayes was the only justification he needed to pivot the narrative. He looked at Jasper, his gaze colder than mountain ice. You are reckless, Jasper. You are weak. You are a liability. Go. Take a long trip. Hide yourself until this is past. If Victor finds you, I will not lift a finger. He turned to Audrey, his trusted successor. Victor Shaw has declared war, Audrey. The death of Hayes is our justification. The injury to his daughter is a tactical advantage. It shows his carelessness, his brutality. We move the West Ridge sail up to this evening. We seize his primary storage hub immediately, and we make sure the local press reports that Lila Shaw was riding with a known Shaw accomplice, a casualty of her father's criminal enterprise. Audrey's face hardened, the look of horror replaced entirely by the ice of her father's nature. We bury the truth, Father, but we don't start this fire of open war. We let Victor start it, and we control the response. We hit him where it hurts, legally and financially. No more bullets. That's what Riley wants us to do, and we play his game for now. Riley? Elias sneered. Riley is irrelevant. Now is the time for action. Bring me the accounting ledger, Audrey. Let's see what assets we can strip from Victor before his vengeance drowns us both. Marshal Jake Riley arrived back at the sheriff's office in Ironwood Town Square, finding it abandoned by the sheriff, who had fled the jurisdiction entirely. Riley had already anticipated this failure of local law. He was not here to investigate the crime. He was here to use the tragedy to enforce his own mandate. He saw the Shaw-Thorne feud not as a local issue, but as a cancer of corruption that metastasized across the state economy. He walked over to the sheriff's dusty filing cabinet and pulled out a pre-drafted, meticulously prepared federal order, a document he had spent months perfecting, waiting for the first drop of innocent blood to justify its use. Riley knew that the injury to Lila Shaw and the death of Hayes represented the ultimate political leverage. It proved that the local law or lack thereof was incapable of maintaining civil order. He called his field operative, a quiet, effective woman named Agent Elena Vance, currently stationed in the state capitol, awaiting his command. The spark has caught fire, Agent Vance, Riley said into the satellite phone, his voice calm and precise. The Shaw daughter is critically injured, and a Thorne man is dead. The families are arming for open conflict. Initiate Protocol Icarus. Protocol Icarus was Riley's contingency plan for a total collapse of local governance. A federal injunction freezing all financial and physical assets of both the Shaw and Thorne families, simultaneously issuing warrants for the arrest of Victor Shaw and Elias Thorne on charges of illegal conspiracy, racketeering, and gross negligence leading to multiple deaths. Riley intended to decapitate both organizations at once and leave them to cannibalize each other while the federal government seized control. He walked over to the sheriff's corkboard, peeling off the old, dusty notices for missing pets and local church bake sales. He used a sharp-tipped marker to pin up the federal order in the center of the board, clearly visible to the empty town square. The order was not a request. It was an absolute declaration of war from the federal government on both criminal empires. Within the hour, Silas Knox, Victor's head of security, arrived, smelling the smoke of Victor's impending retribution. He was followed shortly by Rhea Audrey Thorne's high-powered legal representative, who was frantic at the news of the freeze order word of the injunction, was already spreading through financial circles like wildfire. Silas read the order, his face slack with shock. "You can't do this. This is an overreach. This is confiscation. Victor will burn the state down." Rhea, always composed in a crisis, managed to regain her professional veneer quickly. "Marshal, this injunction is legally tenuous. On what demonstrable grounds can you seize the assets of two legitimate tax-paying businesses?" Riley leaned back against the desk, his eyes cold and unwavering. "On the grounds that both families are responsible for a daylight confrontation that resulted in a woman clinging to life and a man's life ending. You want to talk about legality, counselor? I have 20 years of evidence showing money laundering, illegal arms dealing, and corruption that reaches into the State House and the U.S. Senate. This order is the least of your concerns. It's the consequence of your father's failures." He then delivered his ultimatum. "I am giving both Victor Shaw and Elias Thorne 24 hours to turn themselves in. If they comply, the charges are limited to financial crimes and conspiracy. If they do not, I will personally lead a federal task force into Ironwood, and every armed man on both sides will be charged with murder and domestic terrorism. The war ends now. You deliver the message." Rhea and Silas exchanged a look of pure mutual terror. They understood that the law had finally arrived, not as a tool to be bought or manipulated, but as a wrecking ball capable of leveling the entire territory. They left the office, united only in their mission to relay the devastating news to their masters. The news of the federal seizure hit both Victor and Elias with the force of a hammer blow, instantly paralyzing their ability to retaliate. Victor, already consumed by vengeance for Lila, was now caged. His bloodlust was met with an impenetrable wall of law. "Riley?" Victor screamed, slamming his fist onto his desk, shattering a glass picture frame. "He thinks he can stop me with paper. He thinks he can freeze my money while my daughter is bleeding because of Thorne? I will burn this town to the ground before I let a federal agent decide my fate." Caleb, his face etched with exhaustion, guilt, and the weight of the last 3 hours, stepped forward, confronting his father. "Father, we need to think. Riley isn't Silas or Rhea. He is the federal government. If you fight this, you lose the land, the name, everything. We have to comply, use the legal system, and fight the charges. That's the only way to save Ironwood." Victor looked at his only surviving son. "You sound like a Thorne, Caleb. You sound like you've already surrendered. This is our moment. We kill Elias Thorne, we take the Syndicate, and Riley will have nothing left to investigate but a new order." But the cost was too high. Silas, his voice trembling, pointed to the federal injunction on Victor's primary account, already confirmed by the bank's panic call. "Mr. Shaw, the funds are gone. We can't pay the men, we can't buy the supplies. Riley has starved us out before the fight even began." Victor fell silent, trapped. His pride, his endless fury was now worthless. Across the valley, Elias Thorne reacted with a different kind of icy fury. The audacity. A federal injunction on my assets? I built this name. I bought this town. He thinks I will crumble for a few zeros in a bank account? Audrey, however, was disturbingly calm. "He has us cornered, Father, but he gave us an out. He wants you. He doesn't want the Empire yet. If you turn yourself in, the Syndicate can operate, and we can fight the charges from the inside. If you run, he dismantles everything and we lose all leverage." Elias realized the truth. Riley wasn't after justice. He was after control. By freezing the money, he forced the patriarchs to choose between their life and their legacy. Elias Thorne loved his power more than his freedom. "Audrey, you will take full operational control. You will contact the best defense lawyers in the state. I will surrender, but I will not lose. I am buying us time. But let Victor Shaw be warned. His daughter's injury will be used against him, and the death of Hayes will be laid entirely at his feet. The war has changed, but the objective has not. The Shaws must fall." As the sun began its descent, the inevitable played out. Elias Thorne, accompanied by a coolly composed Audrey, drove calmly to the sheriff's office and surrendered to Agent Vance. He walked into federal custody with the arrogance of a man certain he would walk out again, having secured his empire's survival. Victor Shaw, however, refused to surrender. He saw it as the ultimate humiliating defeat. He sat by Lila's bedside, holding her hand, watching the rhythmic beep of the life support machine, a man utterly broken by his own destructive pride. He slipped out the back of the compound before dawn, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving territory he once ruled. Victor Shaw became a fugitive. Marshal Jake Riley watched the proceedings from a hill overlooking the town. The patriarchs had made their choices, and the families were decimated. Elias was contained. Victor was still loose, a loose cannon, but one whose ammunition had been stolen by the Seizure. The true inheritors of the conflict were left behind. Audrey Thorne, now effectively running the Syndicate, sat alone in her father's massive office, the weight of a multi-million-dollar criminal empire settled on her young shoulders. She was the Syndicate now, and Caleb Shaw, sitting alone at his kitchen table, watched the news report that declared his father a fugitive and his sister clinging to life. He was a desperate man, trapped in a burning house. He was done being Victor's reluctant son. He was the last line of defense. The claim was no longer about land or pride. It was about saving the few people he had left. The scythe had harvested the innocent, and now the survivors were ready to reap the whirlwinds.